Number 1. Jodi Arias, the obsessive ex who could not let go. There are cases in the world of true crime that seem almost impossible to fully comprehend, not because the facts are scarce, but because the facts themselves are so deeply unsettling in what they reveal about the nature of obsession and the devastating consequences it can have on another human being. The story of Jodi and Arias and Travis Victor Alexander is exactly that kind of case. One where what began as an ordinary romantic connection between two people at a professional conference in Las Vegas, Nevada, in September 2006 eventually collapsed into one of the most closely followed murder trials in American television history. Travis Alexander was 30 years old at the time of his death in June 2008, a motivated and well-liked man from Mesa, Arizona, who worked as an insurance salesman and gave motivational speeches, a person described by those who knew him as someone who could walk into any room and immediately lift the energy of everyone around him. He was deeply committed to his Mormon faith, a faith that defined much of his daily life and the values he tried to project to the world. Jodi and Arias was born on July 9, 1980, in Salinas, California, and by the time she met Travis at that September 2006 convention, she was 26 years old, working as an aspiring saleswoman and photographer, a woman whose outward personality was warm and engaging and whose interest in Travis appeared, at least on the surface, to be sincere. The two connected quickly, and what followed was a relationship that Travis's friends and family would later describe as increasingly complicated and difficult to navigate. By November 2006, Jodi had converted to the Mormon faith, Alexander's own religion, a gesture that many who knew them interpreted as a significant personal step driven by her desire to deepen her connection to Travis. The couple formally dated for only a few months before Travis ended the romantic relationship in June 2007, though the two continued to maintain contact and, according to prosecutors and witnesses, continued to see each other on an intimate basis even after the breakup. Those who were close to Travis during this period later testified that he had begun to feel deeply uncomfortable with Jodi's behavior following their breakup. There were reports of slashed tires, hacked email and bank accounts, and a sense among Travis's inner circle that Jodi had not accepted the end of the relationship in the way that he had. Travis reportedly told friends that Jodi was following him on dates with other women and making his personal life feel surveilled and unsafe, concerns that he expressed to multiple people in his social circle, but that he never formally reported to law enforcement. The investigation into Travis Alexander's death began on June 9, 2008, when a group of his close friends entered his home in Mesa after he failed to show up for an important conference call and had not been responding to messages for several days. What they found inside that home was a scene that would stay with every person who entered it for the rest of their lives. Travis Alexander's body was discovered in the shower of his bathroom, and the medical examiner later determined that he had suffered an extraordinary number of injuries, 27 to 29 stab wounds, a deeply serious wound to his throat, and a gunshot wound to the head, all of which occurred on or around June 4, 2008. The pattern and severity of the injuries led investigators to note very early in their analysis that this was what forensic professionals often refer to as overkill, meaning that the level of harm inflicted went far beyond what would have been required to end a life and instead indicated a profound level of emotional intensity in the person responsible. Investigators who processed the scene recovered two critically important pieces of evidence that would become central to the entire prosecution case against Jodi Arias. The first was photographic evidence, time-stamped photographs taken with Travis's own camera that placed Jodi Arias at the scene on June 4, 2008, the very day the medical examiner determined Travis had died, despite the fact that Jodi had been insisting to everyone who asked that the last time she had seen Travis was in April 2008, weeks before his death. Among the photographs recovered from the camera were images taken during the hours before Travis died, as well as a photograph that appeared to have been taken accidentally during the altercation itself, capturing a fragment of the scene that investigators found extraordinarily significant in establishing the sequence of events. The second critical piece of evidence was DNA, biological material recovered from the crime scene that definitively linked Jodi Arias to the location on the day in question, entirely dismantling the version of events she had initially presented to detectives. Jodi Arias was arrested on July 15, 2008, on suspicion of first-degree murder. Following her arrest, her account of what happened on June 4, 2008 shifted dramatically. In her first version of events, she denied being at Travis's home at all. In her second version, she claimed that she had been present when two unidentified intruders broke into the home and attacked both her and Travis, with Travis losing his life as a result of that attack. By the time the case reached trial in January 2013, Arias had settled on a third explanation, that she had indeed been responsible for Travis Alexander's death, but that she had acted entirely in self-defense after Travis became physically aggressive toward her following an accidental incident with his camera. The trial of Jodi and Arias opened on January 2, 2013, before Judge Sherry Stevens at the Maricopa County Superior Court in Phoenix, Arizona, and it immediately captured the attention of the entire country, partly because of the level of detail that emerged about the private lives of both Jodi and Travis, and partly because of the extraordinary nature of Jodi Arias's testimony, during which she took the witness stand for 18 full days, one of the longest periods of self-testimony by a defendant in American murder trial history. The prosecution, led by Juan Martinez, presented Jodi Arias as a woman consumed by jealousy and obsession, one who had made a calculated decision to end Travis Alexander's life when she discovered he was moving forward romantically with other women and had no intention of building a future with her. Martinez walked the jury through the photographic evidence, the DNA evidence, the witness testimony about Jodi's prior behavior toward Travis, and the three completely different versions of events that Arias had offered since her arrest, each of which she had abandoned when confronted with contradicting physical evidence. The defense team, in turn, worked to construct a portrait of Jodi Arias as a person who had endured emotional and psychological harm within her relationship with Travis and who had genuinely feared for her safety on the day she said she acted in self-defense. Jodi Arias herself, during those 18 days on the witness stand, described the relationship in deeply personal terms, offered her own characterizations of Travis's behavior, and maintained with extraordinary composure throughout much of her testimony that she had not planned or intended to harm Travis Alexander. The prosecution's closing argument addressed this composure directly, noting that the physical evidence told a categorically different story than the one Jodi was presenting, and that the sheer number and character of the injuries Travis sustained were entirely inconsistent with an act of self-preservation. On May 8, 2013, the jury reached its verdict. Jodi and Arias was found guilty of first-degree murder. The subsequent penalty phase of the trial, during which the jury was asked to determine whether Arias should receive the death penalty or life in prison, resulted in a hung jury, meaning the 12 jurors could not reach a unanimous decision. A second penalty phase jury was convened in 2014 and similarly could not agree, resulting in a second hung jury. Under Arizona law, because two separate juries had been unable to reach a decision on punishment, the responsibility for sentencing fell to Judge Sherry Stevens. On April 13, 2015, Judge Stevens sentenced Jodi and Arias to natural life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jodi Arias has remained incarcerated at the Arizona State Prison Complex, Perryville, ever since. Travis Alexander's family, including his siblings, have spoken publicly over the years about the long and painful journey of watching the legal proceedings unfold across nearly 7 years from the discovery of Travis's body to the final sentencing. And they have described the experience of losing their brother in such public and detailed circumstances as something they have had to find ways to carry through every phase of their lives. The case prompted widespread public discussion about the dynamics of obsessive relationships, the warning signs that those who cared for Travis had observed, but that had never been formally escalated to authorities, and the ways in which modern technology, in the form of digital photographs taken with Travis's own camera, ultimately played a decisive role in bringing the truth of what happened on June 4, 2008, into the light of a courtroom for the entire world to witness. Number 2. Chris Watts, the family man who was living a secret life. Among the true crime cases that have emerged in recent years, few have generated the level of public shock and sustained collective grief that surrounds the story of Christopher Lee Watts and the family he destroyed in August 2018 in Frederick, Colorado. This was a case that seemed, In the first hours after the disappearance of Shannon Watts and her two young daughters was reported, like it might be a tragic accident or a sudden family crisis, the kind of unsettling but not necessarily sinister situation that sometimes resolves itself. Instead, it resolved into something that a judge at sentencing would describe as perhaps the most inhumane and vicious crime he had seen in his entire career on the bench. Christopher Lee Watts was born on May 16, 1985, in Spring Lake, North Carolina, and by 2018 he was 33 years old, living in Frederick, Colorado, where he worked as a field coordinator for Anadarko Petroleum, a position he had been promoted to relatively recently. To nearly everyone who knew him, Chris Watts presented as a quiet, even-tempered, cooperative man, a person who seemed content with his family life, who showed up to neighborhood events, who appeared on local television news looking appropriately worried when his wife and daughters went missing and made public appeals for their safe return. The picture he projected was of a devoted father and husband who could not understand what had happened to the people he loved most. Shannon Catherine Razusek Watts was born on January 10, 1984, in Aberdeen, North Carolina, and by the time she and Chris met through Facebook in 2010 and married in November 2012, she had built a warm and visible life for herself and her young family. Shannon was active on social media, sharing videos and photographs of her daughters Bella Marie Watts, born December 17, 2013, and Celeste Catherine Watts, born July 17, 2015, as well as content related to her work promoting wellness products online. She was, by all accounts from friends and family, a devoted and energetic mother who threw herself into the lives of her children with genuine joy and commitment. In the summer of 2018, Shannon was 15 weeks pregnant with the couple's third child, a boy they had planned to name Nico. The family was navigating significant financial pressure at the time. Court records later revealed that the Watts family had filed for bankruptcy in 2015, and that financial strain had continued to be a source of difficulty in the years that followed. Though by the summer of 2018, Shannon was working hard through her social media presence to build a more stable income stream. What was not visible to the outside world, and what investigators would piece together from thousands of pages of documents, text messages, phone records, and interviews following the disappearance, was the fact that Christopher Watts had, beginning in June 2018, entered into a romantic relationship with a co-worker named Nicole Kessinger, a 30-year-old contract employee at Anadarko Petroleum who worked in the safety division. Watts had told Kessinger from very early in their relationship that he was in the process of separating from his wife, that the marriage was effectively over, and that he was working toward a new chapter in his life. Kessinger later told investigators that she had genuinely believed Watts's version of events, that she had no knowledge that Shannon was pregnant, and that she had been deceived throughout the brief months of their relationship. Text messages and internet search histories recovered by investigators told a more complicated story on both sides. Kessinger had searched online for information about marrying someone who was having an affair and had spent time looking at wedding dresses while simultaneously searching for information about Shannon Watts, while Chris Watts had conducted his own online searches that investigators found significant in understanding his state of mind during the period leading up to August 13, 2018. Shannon Watts had spent much of the summer in North Carolina with her daughters, in part to help manage the medical needs of Bella, who had been experiencing health difficulties, and had returned to the family home in Frederick in the early hours of the morning of August 13, 2018, having been away for several weeks at a business conference and family visit. Friends who had driven her home from the airport later noted that the conversation during the ride included some reference to marital difficulties, that Shannon had mentioned to them that something felt wrong with her marriage, that Chris had seemed distant and disconnected during her most recent visit to Colorado, and that she was worried about the state of their relationship. What happened in the early hours of August 13th inside the Watts family home on Saratoga Trail in Frederick, Colorado, was reconstructed through Christopher Watts's own eventual confessions to investigators, the first of which came days after the murders in the course of a police interview, and the more detailed of which came months later in a recorded confession at a correctional facility in Wisconsin. According to what Watts ultimately told authorities, a confrontation occurred in the couple's bedroom in the early morning hours of August 13th, during which Shannon informed him that she was not willing to let him see the children if the marriage was ending, and that it was during or immediately following this confrontation that he strangled Shanann in their bed. His daughters, Bella and Celeste, were also in the house at the time and were later smothered. Watts then transported the bodies of his wife and daughters to a remote oil field site owned by Anadarko Petroleum, where he was employed and where he disposed of them. Shanann's body was buried in a shallow grave, and the bodies of Bella and Celeste were placed in oil storage tanks. On the morning of August 13th, Shanann's friend Nicole Atkinson arrived at the Watts home after being unable to reach Shanann by phone and becoming increasingly alarmed. Atkinson eventually contacted police, and officers arrived at the home, where they encountered Chris Watts, who appeared cooperative and presented a calm and articulate concern about his missing family. Watts then gave a live interview to a local news station in which he made emotional appeals for the safe return of his wife and daughters, a performance that investigators later described as striking for its lack of authentic distress. Within days, investigators from the Frederick Police Department, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and the FBI had assembled enough information from phone records, camera footage from the Anadarko oil field site, and the account of Nicole Kessinger, who had come forward voluntarily, to arrest Christopher Watts on August 15, 2018. Watts was initially confronted with surveillance footage showing his truck at the Anadarko site on the morning of August 13, and initially changed elements of his account before ultimately admitting his responsibility for the deaths of Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and the unborn child Nico. On November 6, 2018, Christopher Watts entered guilty pleas to 9 charges, including 5 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased body. In exchange for the guilty plea, prosecutors agreed not to pursue the death penalty, an arrangement made at the specific request of Shanann's family, whose position was communicated to the court by Shanann's mother Sandy Razusek, who stood before Judge Marcelo Kopkow at the Weld County Courthouse and said that she had not wanted death for Christopher Watts because that was not her right and that his life was between him and God. On November 19, 2018, Judge Kopkow sentenced Christopher Lee Watts to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 84 years for the remaining charges. Watts was subsequently transferred to a federal correctional institution in Dodge County, Wisconsin, where he has remained. In a follow-up jailhouse interview conducted by investigators from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation and the FBI in February 2019, Watts provided additional details about the morning of August 13th, including an account of what happened when his 4-year-old daughter Bella walked into the bedroom and asked what was wrong with her mother, a detail that became one of the most heartbreaking and widely reported elements of the entire case. The story of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste Watts prompted an enormous wave of public mourning, and the case has since become the subject of documentaries, films, and books that have examined both the tragedy of the victims and the questions surrounding how a family that appeared so ordinary on the outside could be concealing such profound dysfunction and danger within. Number 3. Scott Peterson, the husband who smiled through every lie. Some criminal cases become cultural touchstones not simply because of the crime itself, but because of the way the case forces the public to confront the gap between outward appearances and inner reality. The distance between the face a person shows the world and what that person is actually capable of doing when the world is not watching. The case of Scott Lee Peterson and the December 2002 disappearance and murder of his wife Lacey Denise Peterson is exactly that kind of case. One that gripped the United States for nearly 2 years before a verdict was reached in November 2004, and one that continues to surface in public conversation more than 2 decades later. Scott Peterson was born on October 24, 1972, and by 2002, he was 30 years old, living with his wife in Modesto, California, where he worked as a fertilizer salesman. He and Lacey, born Lacey Denise Rocha on May 4, 1975, had met in 1994 while both were students at California Polytechnic State University, San Luis Obispo, and they had married in August 1997 after a few years of dating. By the fall of 2002, Lacey Peterson was 27 years old and 8 months pregnant with the couple's first child, a boy they had planned to name Connor. To family members, friends, and neighbors, Lacey was described in the most consistent and affectionate terms: warm, energetic, always smiling. Someone who seemed genuinely thrilled about the coming arrival of her son and who had spent the months of her pregnancy joyfully preparing for the next chapter of her life as a mother. On the morning of December 24th, 2002, Christmas Eve, Scott Peterson told investigators that he had left the family home on Covina Avenue in Modesto sometime in the late morning to drive approximately 90 miles to the Berkeley Marina, where he said he had gone on a solo fishing trip. When he returned home that afternoon, he said Lacey was not there. He reported her missing to police that day, setting in motion one of the largest and most emotionally charged missing person investigations in California history. The search for Lacey Peterson became a national story almost immediately, drawing volunteers from across the region and generating round-the-clock media coverage during the final weeks of 2002 and into 2003. Candlelight vigils were held, flyers were distributed across the state, and Lacey's family, particularly her mother Sharon Rocha, became a visible and passionate force in the effort to find her. Scott Peterson participated in public appeals and gave media interviews, presenting himself as a distraught husband desperate to find his missing wife. But within weeks, a development emerged that fundamentally shifted the direction of the investigation. In late January 2003, a 28-year-old massage therapist named Amber Fry came forward and told investigators that she had been in a romantic relationship with Scott Peterson, a relationship she had entered into believing that Peterson was a single man. The revelation that Scott had been conducting a secret affair with Amber Fry, and that on December 9, 2002, just 2 weeks before Lacey disappeared, he had told Fry that he had lost his wife and that this would be his first holiday season without her. A statement made while Lacey was still alive transformed public perception of the case dramatically and refocused investigators' attention squarely on Scott. Fry cooperated extensively with law enforcement following her initial disclosure, agreeing to record her subsequent phone calls with Peterson, conversations that investigators later described as invaluable in building their understanding of Peterson's state of mind and behavior in the months surrounding Lacey's disappearance. The calls documented Scott Peterson continuing his affair with Amber even as the search for Lacey was ongoing, a detail that was later presented to the jury as evidence of his emotional disconnection from the tragedy he was publicly presenting himself as a victim of. In April 2003, more than 3 months after Lacey's disappearance, the remains of a male fetus and a female torso were discovered along the shoreline of San Francisco Bay, in the same general area where Scott Peterson said he had been fishing on the day his wife went missing. Forensic testing confirmed that the remains were those of Lacey and Connor Peterson. Scott Peterson was arrested on April 18, 2003, in La Jolla, California, where he had been found with his hair and beard newly dyed a different color and in possession of a significant amount of cash and multiple cell phones. Circumstances that prosecutors would later argue indicated he had been preparing to flee the country rather than face the investigation. Peterson was charged with 2 counts of murder: first-degree murder for the death of Lacey Peterson and second-degree murder for the death of their unborn son Connor, under California's fetal homicide law. The trial of Scott Peterson began in June 2004 in Redwood City, California, after a change of venue from Stanislaus County due to the intense local media coverage. The prosecution, led by Rick DeStaso, built its case entirely on circumstantial evidence, as there was no murder weapon, no eyewitness to the crime, and no direct forensic evidence linking Scott to the specific act of killing his wife. What the prosecution offered instead was a comprehensive picture of motive, opportunity, deception, and suspicious behavior, the secret affair with Amber Fry, the life insurance policy Scott had taken out on Lacey without her knowledge, the fact that the location where Lacey's body was found was consistent with a body being disposed of from a boat launched at the Berkeley Marina, and the mountain of evidence showing that Scott Peterson had lied repeatedly and elaborately to investigators, the media, and his own family throughout the course of the investigation. The defense, led by Mark Garagos, argued that the prosecution's circumstantial case was insufficient, that Scott Peterson had not been proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, and proposed an alternate theory in which Lacey had been harmed by someone else after Scott had left for his fishing trip. After a 7-month trial, the jury deliberated for 7 days before returning its verdict on November 12, 2004. Scott Lee Peterson was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Laci Peterson and second-degree murder in the death of Connor Peterson. The verdict was greeted with an outpouring of emotion from people who had gathered outside the Redwood City Courthouse to hear the announcement. At sentencing in March 2005, Peterson was ordered to death by lethal injection. In August 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned Peterson's death sentence, citing procedural errors in the jury selection process. He was subsequently resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Laci's mother Sharon Rocha channeled her grief into advocacy, supporting the passage of the Federal Unborn Victims of Violence Act in 2004, commonly referred to as Laci and Connor's Law, which established that the killing of a pregnant woman in the course of a federal crime constitutes two separate offenses. Scott Peterson has continued to maintain his innocence from prison, and the Los Angeles Innocence Project announced in January 2024 that it was investigating his claim of actual innocence. A development that has kept the case periodically in the news and that has ensured that the tragedy of Laci and Connor Peterson remains a subject of ongoing legal and public interest more than 2 decades after Christmas Eve 2002. Number 4. Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, the Moors murderers. There are criminal cases that define an era and leave an indelible mark on the collective memory of an entire nation. Cases so profoundly troubling in their nature that they become permanent reference points in how a society understands the capacity for harm that can exist within ordinary-looking people living ordinary-looking lives. The case of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, known in Britain and around the world as the Moors murderers, is precisely that kind of case. One that shook the United Kingdom in the mid-1960s to its foundations, and that continues, more than 6 decades later, to be studied, examined, and mourned. Ian Brady was born in Glasgow, Scotland, on January 2, 1938, to a single mother who could not care for him in his early years, and he was raised by a foster family in Glasgow before eventually relocating to Manchester, England, as a young man. His childhood and adolescence were marked by a pattern of behavioral difficulties, run-ins with juvenile authorities for burglary and other petty offenses, and a deepening fascination with extremist ideology and dark literature that those who knew him during that period later described as a defining characteristic of who he was becoming. Myra Hindley was born in Manchester on July 23, 1942, and grew up in circumstances that were not dramatically unusual for working-class Manchester of that era, though she experienced significant personal disruption, including the early loss of a close childhood friend, which those who later studied her life and psychology suggested had a meaningful impact on her emotional development. The two met in 1961 at a chemical products company called Millward's Merchandise in Manchester, where both were employed, and what began as a professional acquaintance slowly deepened into an intense romantic relationship that Brady quickly directed toward the expression of the darkest elements of his worldview and ideology. By 1963, Brady had begun sharing with Hindley his obsession with what he described as committing the perfect crime, a concept rooted in his readings of extremist texts and philosophy, and Hindley, deeply under his influence, became not a passive observer but an active participant in what followed. Between July 1963 and October 1965, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley abducted and killed 5 children and young teenagers in and around Manchester, England. The victims were Pauline Reed, 16 years old, in July 1963, John Kilbride, 12 years old, in November 1963, Keith Bennett, 12 years old, in June 1964, Leslie and Downey, 10 years old, in December 1964, and Edward Evans, 17 years old, in October 1965. At least 4 of the 5 victims were subjected to serious harm before their deaths. The bodies of most of the victims were buried in shallow graves on the desolate moorland known as Saddleworth Moor, on the outskirts of Manchester, a landscape so bleak and remote that it became permanently associated with the crimes in the public imagination and gave rise to the name by which Brady and Hindley would forever be known. The case came to the attention of authorities in October 1965 in circumstances that illustrated how the most carefully concealed crimes can be brought to light by unexpected human factors. Brady had invited Hindley's brother-in-law, David Smith, to their home on Wardlebrook Avenue in Hattersley, and Smith witnessed Brady carrying out the killing of Edward Evans in the couple's living room. Horrified by what he had seen, Smith contacted the police the following morning, and officers arrived at the home that same day. The evidence recovered from the home, including a left luggage ticket that led investigators to a station locker containing tape recordings and photographs documenting the harm done to Leslie and Downey, provided investigators with material that was described at the time and since as among the most disturbing ever encountered in a British criminal investigation. The pair were formally arrested in October 1965, Brady on October 7th and Hindley on October 11th. Their trial opened at Chester Assizes in April 1966 and became, at the time, one of the most closely followed criminal proceedings in British legal history. The case against Brady and Hindley rested on the physical evidence recovered from the home, the testimony of David Smith, and the extraordinarily disturbing tape recordings and photographs that documented the pair's actions against Leslie and Downey. On May 6, 1966, the jury returned its verdicts. Ian Brady was found guilty of 3 murders, those of Leslie and Downey, John Kilbride, and Edward Evans, and sentenced to 3 concurrent life sentences. Myra Hindley was found guilty of the murders of Leslie and Downey and Edward Evans, and of being an accessory to the murder of John Kilbride, and received 2 concurrent life sentences plus 7 years for the accessory conviction. The presiding judge described them as 2 sadistic killers of the utmost depravity. The case did not end there. In 1985, investigators reopened inquiries into the whereabouts of the bodies of Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett, 2 of the 5 victims whose remains had not been found in 1966. Brady and Hindley both confessed in 1987 to the murders of Reed and Bennett. The following year, during searches of Saddleworth Moor that Brady participated in directly, the body of Pauline Reed was recovered. The body of Keith Bennett has never been found. Brady died on May 15, 2017, at Ashworth Hospital in Merseyside, at the age of 79, having spent more than 50 years in confinement, the final decades of which were in a high-security psychiatric facility after he was diagnosed as a psychopath in 1985. He had stated repeatedly that he did not wish to be released and that he preferred death to freedom. Myra Hindley died on November 15, 2002, at West Suffolk Hospital, at the age of 60, after serving 36 years in prison. She had made numerous appeals for release over the decades, claiming rehabilitation and reform, but every appeal was denied. The family of Keith Bennett has never received closure. His mother, Winnie Johnson, spent decades searching Saddleworth Moor and pleading publicly with both Brady and Hindley to reveal her son's resting place. Winnie Johnson died in August 2012 without ever learning where her child was buried, a fact that remains one of the most painful and unresolved elements of a case that left 5 families permanently changed and left an entire generation in Britain with an altered and more anxious understanding of the world their children moved through. Number 5. Fred and Rose West, The House of Horrors. The story of Frederick Walter Stephen West and Rosemary Pauline West is one that reaches back into a darkness so profound and so prolonged that investigators who worked on the case in 1994, when the full extent of what had taken place inside the family home at 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester, England, began to come to light, have described the experience of piecing together the evidence as unlike anything they had encountered before or since in their professional careers. This was not a single crime, or even a series of crimes committed over a short period of time. It was a pattern of behavior that extended across 2 decades, that claimed at least 12 confirmed victims, that was committed largely within the walls of a family home shared with the couple's own children, and that was so deeply concealed for so long that its discovery in 1994 sent genuine shock through a nation that believed it had seen most of what human cruelty could produce. Fred West was born on September 29, 1941, in the small village of Muchmarcle, Herefordshire, England, the third of 6 children in a family that was described by those familiar with his background as deeply troubled. His early life was marked by significant harm and dysfunction, circumstances that those who later studied his psychology suggested had played a formative role in the profoundly disturbed worldview he developed as a young man. By the time he met Rosemary Letts, who would become his second wife and his partner in the crimes that would define both of their names in criminal history, He had already been married once and had already committed crimes for which he had been prosecuted and imprisoned. Rose West was born on November 29, 1953, in Devon, England, and grew up in circumstances that investigators and psychologists later characterized as having exposed her to significant harm during her formative years. She was 15 years old when she first met Fred West, who was at that time 25, and the relationship that developed between them was one that those who observed it from the outside struggled to characterize cleanly as either a love story or something else entirely. A dynamic in which control, manipulation, and shared pathology appeared to be the defining forces rather than any conventional form of mutual affection. Fred and Rose West settled at 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester in 1972, and the home they established there became over the following years a place where they both conducted a range of deeply harmful behaviors that involved the exploitation and harm of vulnerable people. Young women who were lodgers, nannies, hitchhikers, or runaways who had the profound misfortune of coming into contact with the Wests. The crimes committed at Cromwell Street and at previous addresses involved the abduction and confinement of young women who were subjected to extended periods of psychological and physical control before being killed and their bodies dismembered and buried within the property. The victims ranged from Charmaine West, Fred's stepdaughter from his first marriage, who was killed by Rose in 1971 while Fred was serving a brief prison sentence, to Heather West, the daughter of both Fred and Rose, who was 16 years old when she was killed in 1987 after reportedly attempting to disclose to someone outside the family what was happening inside the Cromwell Street home. In addition to Heather and Charmaine, the confirmed victims included Linda Goff, Carol and Cooper, Lucy Partington, Therese Siegenthaler, Shirley Hubbard, Juanita Mott, Shirley Robinson, and Allison Chambers, as well as Fred's first wife Rena, and a woman named Anna McFall. The investigation that ultimately exposed the full scale of what had happened at Cromwell Street began in 1992 when police received information suggesting that Heather West, who had not been seen since 1987 and whose absence had been explained by Fred and Rose to their children as a voluntary departure to work elsewhere, might be buried in the back garden of the family home. Police obtained a warrant to excavate the garden in February 1994, and on February 24th of that year, the first human remains were discovered. Over the course of the subsequent investigation, the remains of 9 victims were recovered from beneath the floor of the cellar, the garden, and other areas of the Cromwell Street property, with additional remains found at earlier addresses. Fred West was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. However, on January 1, 1995, while being held on remand at Birmingham Prison, Fred West died by suicide in his cell, ending the possibility of a full public accounting of his role in the crimes in a courtroom setting. Rose West was tried separately. Her trial began at Winchester Crown Court in October 1995, and Rose maintained throughout that she had been unaware of her husband's crimes and had played no role in the harm done to the victims. The prosecution presented extensive evidence, including testimony from women who had themselves experienced harm at the hands of both Fred and Rose, as well as forensic and circumstantial evidence built over the course of an enormous investigation to establish that Rose West had been an active and knowing participant in the crimes committed at Cromwell Street and elsewhere. In November 1995, the jury returned its verdict. Rose West was found guilty of 10 counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with a whole life order, meaning she will never be released. The home at 25 Cromwell Street was subsequently demolished by Gloucester City Council in 1996, and the site was redesigned specifically to prevent it from becoming a location of morbid interest or commemoration. Rose West has continued to maintain her innocence from prison, though subsequent reviews of the evidence have consistently found the verdict to be well supported. The families of the victims have spent the decades since 1994 working to find what peace is available to them in circumstances that made normal grieving nearly impossible, and the case has prompted ongoing conversations in the United Kingdom about the ways in which vulnerable people, particularly young women in precarious circumstances, can fall through the gaps of systems that might otherwise have identified earlier that something was deeply wrong at 25 Cromwell Street. Number 6. Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka, the Ken and Barbie Killers. In September 2006, the city of Niagara-on-the-Lake, Ontario, was the backdrop for what appeared to everyone who attended to be a perfect wedding. A handsome couple, impeccably dressed, surrounded by friends and family in one of the most picturesque settings in Canada. Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka looked, by every outward measure, like exactly the kind of couple that the word wholesome was invented to describe. The Canadian press, years later, would settle on a nickname for them that captured the precise contrast between their surface appearance and the reality of what they had done, the Ken and Barbie killers. It was a name that expressed the profound public revulsion at the discovery that two people who looked so normal, so attractive, so unremarkable, could have been responsible for some of the most disturbing crimes in the history of Canadian law enforcement. Paul Jason Bernardo was born in 1964 in Scarborough, Ontario, a district of Toronto, and grew up in circumstances that those who studied his development later characterized as having included significant domestic instability and exposure to harmful dynamics within the family home. By the time he met Carla Homolka in 1987 at a restaurant in Scarborough, he was 23 years old, she was 17 and still in high school. Bernardo had already been engaging for several months in a pattern of serious criminal behavior in his neighborhood, a pattern that local police investigators had been trying without success to identify the perpetrator of. Between May 1987 and April 1991, Paul Bernardo sexually assaulted at least 14 women in the Scarborough area in a series of incidents that earned him the name the Scarborough Rapist from local media, and that had placed an enormous amount of investigative pressure on Toronto police to identify and arrest the individual responsible. Carla Homolka was entirely unaware of this aspect of Paul's life when they began dating, or so she later maintained, though prosecutors and investigators would spend years after the crimes came to light examining the timeline of what Carla knew and when she knew it. The two became engaged in late 1989, and during the period of their engagement, the nature of their relationship, and particularly the extent to which Carla was aware of Paul's criminal activities, became one of the most disputed and discussed questions in the entire case. The first victim connected to both Paul and Carla was Carla's own younger sister, Tammy Homolka, who was 15 years old in December 1990 when she was drugged during a family gathering at the Homolka home and subjected to a serious assault by Paul Bernardo while Carla, according to the evidence presented at trial, facilitated the situation. Tammy Homolka died that night after losing consciousness and choking, and her death was initially ruled an accident by the medical examiner. In June 1991, just months after the couple's fairy tale wedding in Niagara-on-the-Lake, a 14-year-old girl named Leslie Mahaffey disappeared after being locked out of her family home in Burlington, Ontario. She was abducted by Paul Bernardo, held captive, subjected to serious harm, and killed. Her remains were later discovered in Lake Gibson, encased in concrete. In April 1992, a 15-year-old girl named Kristen French was abducted in broad daylight from a church parking lot in St. Catharines, Ontario, by Paul Bernardo. With Carla's involvement, the couple used a map and stopped to ask Kristen for directions before forcing her into their car. Kristen French was held captive for approximately 3 days and subjected to serious harm before she was killed. Her body was discovered in a ditch on April 30th, 1992. Throughout this entire period, Paul Bernardo had been providing DNA samples to police in the context of the ongoing Scarborough Rapist investigation. Samples that Toronto police did not fully analyze for several years due to a significant investigative backlog, a failure that would later become one of the most criticized and examined procedural errors in Canadian criminal justice history. It was not until after the murders of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French that DNA testing conclusively confirmed that Paul Bernardo was the Scarborough Rapist, and the full investigation into the couple's activities was launched. In January 1993, Carla Homolka went to police after Paul Bernardo subjected her to a serious physical assault, an event that led to her hospitalization with visible injuries. She disclosed her husband's crimes to investigators, portraying herself as a battered spouse who had participated under coercion and fear and negotiated a plea agreement with prosecutors who at that stage did not yet have access to video recordings that would later significantly alter the public understanding of her level of willing participation. Under the terms of the plea agreement, which became deeply controversial in Canada and was referred to by the press as the deal with the devil, Carla Homolka pleaded guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter and received a sentence of 12 years in prison in exchange for her testimony against Paul Bernardo. Paul Bernardo was arrested in February 1993. In 1995, his attorney surrendered to the court videotapes that Brady had hidden within the couple's home, recordings that documented in detail what had happened to the victims during their captivity, and that showed Carla in a role that was far more active and far less coerced than the account she had given to investigators. The revelation of the tape content caused an enormous public outcry in Canada, with many Canadians demanding that the plea agreement with Carla be revisited. The legal system determined, however, that the agreement was binding. Paul Bernardo's trial proceeded in 1995, with Carla as the prosecution's key witness. On September 1, 1995, Bernardo was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 25 years. He was also formally designated a dangerous offender under Canadian law, a designation that has significantly complicated any future parole applications. Carla Homolka served her 12-year sentence and was released from prison on July 5, 2005. She subsequently remarried and had children, and has lived at various addresses in Canada under restrictions related to her proximity to children, a circumstance that has itself been the subject of ongoing public and legal debate. Paul Bernardo remains in prison and has had multiple parole applications denied. Keith Bennett's family in England and the families of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French in Canada share something profoundly in common, a loss that was compounded not simply by the nature of the crimes, but by the extent to which the legal systems that process those crimes left behind feelings of incompleteness and unresolved grief. Number 7. Gerald and Charlene Gallego, the sex slave killers. Some criminal partnerships are driven by a single dominant personality and a secondary figure whose role, whether willing or coerced, amplifies the capacity for harm beyond what either individual might have been capable of alone. The case of Gerald Armand Gallego and Charlene Adele Williams Gallego, who together carried out a series of kidnappings and killings across California and Nevada between September 1978 and November 1980 that claimed the lives of 10 confirmed victims, represents one of the most disturbing examples of this dynamic in modern American criminal history. Gerald Armand Gallego was born on July 17, 1946, in Sacramento, California, into circumstances that forensic psychologists and criminologists who later studied his background described as remarkably significant in understanding the trajectory of his adult behavior. His father had been convicted of killing a law enforcement officer and was executed in the gas chamber in Mississippi in 1955, making him, according to the historical record, the first person to be executed by that method in that state. Gerald's mother worked in circumstances that exposed him during his formative years to instability, rotating adult figures in the home, and an absence of the kind of consistent and caring adult presence that developmental psychologists recognize as critical to the formation of healthy emotional and behavioral patterns. By the time Gerald met Charlene Williams in Sacramento in the late 1970s, he had already been married 5 times, had accumulated a criminal record that included convictions for armed robbery and charges involving inappropriate conduct with a minor, and was by all accounts a deeply troubled individual whose relationships with women had been consistently defined by control and manipulation. Charlene Adele Williams was born on October 19, 1956, in Stockton, California, and presented a surface profile that could not have appeared more different from Gerald's. She came from a comfortable, middle-class background, was intelligent, musically gifted, and had grown up with significantly more stability and advantage than Gerald. Those who have studied the Gallego case have spent considerable time examining why Charlene, with her background and opportunities, became so thoroughly enmeshed in Gerald's world and his crimes. A question that does not yield a simple answer, but that points to dynamics of emotional dependency, manipulation, and a relationship that quickly became defined by Gerald's complete dominance over Charlene's sense of identity and self-worth. By 1977, Charlene and Gerald were living together and had begun what would become their criminal partnership, which Gerald framed to Charlene in terms of his desire to find a perfect companion, a concept that in practice meant the abduction and serious harm of young women whom he intended to keep for his own purposes before disposing of them. The method they used was consistent across the crimes. Charlene, whose appearance and manner were non-threatening and who could approach young women without immediately raising alarm, was deployed by Gerald to make initial contact with victims, often in shopping malls or other public spaces, while Gerald waited nearby. Their first victims were Kippy Vaught, 17, and Rhonda Scheffler, 16, who disappeared from a Sacramento shopping mall on September 11, 1978. The pair were taken to a remote location, where they were subjected to serious harm and then killed, their bodies discovered in Sacramento County. Over the following 26 months, Gerald and Charlene abducted and killed 8 more people. Brenda Judd and Sandra Colley in June 1979, Stacy Redican and Karen Chipman Twiggs in April 1980, Linda Aguilar in June 1980, Virginia Machel in July 1980, and Craig Miller and Mary Elizabeth Sowers in November 1980. The case came to a sudden end on November 2, 1980, when a fraternity brother of Craig Miller's witnessed what appeared to be an altercation near a shopping mall in Sacramento and noted the license plate of the vehicle involved. When police traced the plate to Charlene's parents' vehicle, the investigation quickly focused on Gerald and Charlene, who had by then fled to Omaha, Nebraska. The couple was arrested in Omaha on November 17, 1980. Charlene, facing the full weight of the evidence against them both, negotiated a plea agreement with prosecutors in both California and Nevada, under which she agreed to testify against Gerald in full detail in exchange for a sentence of 16 years and 8 months in Nevada and immunity from prosecution in California. Charlene's testimony in Gerald's trials in 1983 and 1984 provided the foundation for the prosecution case in both states. Gerald Gallego was convicted and sentenced to death in California in 1983 and in Nevada in 1984. He subsequently spent years in the legal appeals process, during which his Nevada death sentence was overturned in 1997 but was reimposed by a new jury in 1999. Gerald Armand Gallego died of cancer on July 18, 2002, at renowned Regional Medical Center in Reno, Nevada, while still on death row at the age of 56. Charlene Gallego served her complete sentence of 16 years and 8 months and was released from the Nevada Department of Corrections in July 1997. She returned to Sacramento, resumed her maiden name of Williams, and has since lived a largely private life. In a 2012 media interview, Charlene expressed remorse for her role in the crimes and suggested that she had been psychologically manipulated and controlled by Gerald, a characterization that has been both accepted and contested by those who have studied the case in depth. The families of the 10 victims whose lives were ended during the Gallego crime spree have lived for more than 4 decades with the reality of what was done to their loved ones, and several family members have spoken over the years about the ongoing pain of knowing that one of the 2 people directly responsible for those deaths walked out of prison after serving fewer than 17 years. Number 8. Pamela Smart and William Flynn, the crime that changed American television. The story of Pamela and Wojciech Smart and her teenage lover William Flynn is one that begins with what appeared to observers at the time to be a straightforward and deeply troubling case of a married woman who manipulated a vulnerable adolescent into carrying out an act she was unwilling to carry out herself. And that became something significantly larger. A case that changed the relationship between American courtrooms and television cameras, inspired a novel and a major Hollywood film, and raised questions about the nature of influence, manipulation, and the boundaries between adult responsibility and adolescent impressionability that are still discussed today. Pamela and Wojciech was born on August 16, 1967, in Miami, Florida, and by 1990, she was 22 years old, working as the director of media services at Winnicott High School in Hampton, New Hampshire. She had married Gregory "Greg" Smart, a 24-year-old insurance salesman, in May 1989, and the couple had settled in a condominium in Derry, New Hampshire. By the account that emerged during the criminal investigation and subsequent trial, the marriage had developed significant difficulties within its first year, with Greg Smart reportedly having engaged in a brief affair of his own that Pamela had discovered and that had left the marriage in a fragile and contentious state. It was during this period of marital difficulty that Pamela Smart began developing a relationship with a student at the high school where she worked, a 15-year-old boy named William "Billy" Flynn, who was participating in a student internship and self-awareness program that Pamela supervised. The relationship between Pamela Smart and Billy Flynn progressed rapidly from a supervisory one to a romantic one, a progression that Flynn later described in testimony as having been initiated by Pamela, who he said made clear to him what kind of relationship she wanted and who he said exercised a powerful influence over him at a period in his life when he was intensely emotionally impressionable. By early 1990, Pamela Smart had, according to the prosecution's account at trial, communicated to Flynn that she needed her husband's life to end, expressing concern that if Greg divorced her, she would lose everything and have nothing to show for the marriage. Flynn testified that Smart had made clear to him that the continuation of their relationship depended on his willingness to do what she was asking. Flynn, deeply attached to Smart and entirely unwilling to contemplate the end of the relationship, agreed. On the evening of May 1, 1990, Billy Flynn and his 17-year-old friend Patrick Randall entered the Smarts' condominium in Derry, New Hampshire, while Pamela was elsewhere with another student intern who would later become a key prosecution witness. When Greg Smart arrived home, he was confronted by Flynn and Randall in the foyer of the condominium. In the encounter that followed, Greg Smart, 24 years old, was shot once in the head by Billy Flynn while Randall restrained him. Greg Smart died at the scene. The investigation into Greg Smart's death initially proceeded without an identified suspect, but it was fundamentally transformed by the actions of Cecilia Pierce, the student intern who had been with Pamela on the night of the killing. Pierce became suspicious of Pamela's behavior in the aftermath of Greg's death and eventually agreed to work with investigators, recording conversations in which Pamela Smart made statements that investigators found to be deeply significant in establishing her awareness of and direction of the events of May 1, 1990. In one recorded conversation, Smart could be heard saying that if Pierce told the truth about what she knew, Smart would spend the rest of her life in prison. Pamela Smart was arrested in August 1990. Billy Flynn and Patrick Randall, along with two other teenagers who had been peripherally involved in the planning of the crime, entered into plea agreements in exchange for their cooperation with prosecutors. Billy Flynn pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 28 years to life in prison. Patrick Randall received the same sentence. The trial of Pamela Smart opened on March 4, 1991, at Rockingham Superior Court in Exeter, New Hampshire, and became the first American murder trial to be broadcast in its entirety on live television, a development that made the proceedings a national cultural event and drew millions of viewers who watched the trial unfold in real time, day by day. The evidence presented at trial included the recorded conversations with Cecilia Pierce, the testimony of Billy Flynn himself, who sobbed on the witness stand as he described his feelings for Smart and the events of May 1, and the testimony of multiple other witnesses who described Pamela's behavior before and after Greg's death. Smart took the stand in her own defense and denied knowledge of any plot, insisting that Flynn and his friends had acted entirely on their own without any instruction from her. After 13 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict on March 22, 1991. Pamela and Smart was found guilty of being an accomplice to first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and tampering with a witness. Judge Douglas Gray sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Pamela Smart has remained incarcerated ever since, at a correctional facility in New York after spending her earlier years of imprisonment in New Hampshire. She has continued throughout her incarceration to assert her innocence and to pursue every available legal avenue to challenge her conviction, including multiple petitions to the New Hampshire governor and executive council requesting a sentence reduction or hearing for parole consideration, all of which have been denied. William Flynn served nearly 25 years in prison in Maine and was granted parole in June 2015 on his 41st birthday. Patrick Randall was also paroled in 2015. The case inspired Joyce Maynard's novel To Die For, which was subsequently adapted into a 1995 film directed by Gus Van Sant and starring Nicole Kidman in the lead role, a film that, while fictional in its specifics, drew unmistakably from the public's familiarity with the Pamela Smart case and the cultural moment it had created through its live television broadcast. Number 9. Charles Starkweather and Carol and Fugate, America's first media murder spree. There are moments in the history of American crime that represent genuine turning points. moments after which the public's understanding of what ordinary young people are capable of, and of what the quiet communities of Middle America can contain beneath their conventional surface, is permanently and irreversibly altered. The events of January 1958, when 19-year-old Charles Raymond Starkweather and his 14-year-old girlfriend Carol and Fugate went on a killing spree across Nebraska and Wyoming that claimed 11 lives in the space of 8 days, represent exactly such a moment. The case generated a level of national media coverage and public panic that was unprecedented for its era, created a legal and psychological reckoning that reverberated through American culture for decades, and directly inspired works of literature, music, and film that cemented the Starkweather case in the permanent record of American criminal history. Charles Raymond Starkweather was born on November 24, 1938, in Lincoln, Nebraska, the third of 7 children in a working-class family. His early years were defined in significant part by a difficult experience of school. He was bullied by classmates for his physical appearance, including bowed legs and a speech impediment, and by the economic circumstances of his family, and he developed a deep resentment toward those he perceived as having had advantages he had been denied. He left school without completing his education and worked a series of manual labor jobs, including as a garbage truck driver in Lincoln, developing during this period a sense of grievance and a fascination with the outlaw figures of American popular culture who seemed to him to have imposed their own will on a world that had refused to accommodate them. Carol Ann Fugate was born on July 30, 1943, in Lincoln, Nebraska, and was 14 years old at the time of the crimes. A minor in every legal and developmental sense of the word, a fact that became central to both the criminal proceedings against her and the ongoing historical and cultural debate about her level of culpability for what occurred. Carol had been in a relationship with Starkweather for some time before January 1958, a relationship that her parents, Marion and Velda Bartlett, strongly disapproved of and had made efforts to end. The killing spree of January 1958 began on December 1, 1957, when Starkweather robbed and killed Robert Calvert, 21 years old, a service station attendant in Lincoln, a crime that was not immediately connected to Starkweather, but that established the pattern of impulsive, resentment-driven harm that would characterize everything that followed. The main spree began on January 21, 1958, when Starkweather went to the Fugate family home and, in a confrontation that escalated with devastating speed, killed Carol's mother Velda Bartlett, stepfather Marion Bartlett, and 2.5-year-old half-sister Betty Jean Bartlett. Carol maintained for the rest of her life that she had been unaware of what had happened to her family during the initial days of the spree, and that she had believed Starkweather's explanation that her family was being held hostage and that she needed to stay with him to protect them. The prosecution at her trial argued otherwise, that she had had multiple opportunities to alert the outside world to what was happening and had chosen not to take them. From January 21 through January 29, Starkweather and Fugate traveled across Nebraska and into Wyoming, and during that period killed 7 more people. August Meyer, 70 years old, Robert Jensen, 17, and Carol King, 16. C. Lauer Ward, 48, his wife Clara Ward, 46, their housekeeper Lillian Finkel, 51, and Merle Collison, 37. A shoe salesman from Montana who was found by Starkweather asleep in his car near Douglas, Wyoming. The spree ended on January 29, 1958, near Douglas, Wyoming, when the car Starkweather was driving was pulled over after a high-speed chase by law enforcement. During the chase, a bullet struck Starkweather in the ear, and he subsequently surrendered to authorities, with Carol running toward the pursuing officers and crying out that Starkweather had been holding her captive. The national media coverage that descended on the case in the hours and days following the arrest was unlike almost anything American journalism had previously experienced in connection with a criminal case. Starkweather and Fugate became front-page news across the country, and the image of 2 young people from ordinary Nebraska backgrounds having traveled 8 days across 2 states, leaving 11 people dead, shattered every assumption that American communities had about safety, youth, and the nature of danger. Starkweather's trial began in May 1958 at the Lancaster County District Court in Lincoln, Nebraska. He was tried for the murder of Robert Jensen and was convicted on May 23, 1958, with the jury recommending the death penalty. His appeals were rejected at every level, and on June 25, 1959, Charles Raymond Starkweather was executed by electric chair at the Nebraska State Penitentiary in Lincoln. He was 20 years old at the time of his execution. Carol and Fugate's trial began in October 1958. The prosecution sought to establish that she had been a willing participant in the killings rather than a captive of Starkweather, and presented evidence of opportunities she had allegedly had to alert people to what was happening that she had not taken. The defense argued that she was a frightened 14-year-old girl who had done what she believed was necessary to stay alive. On November 21, 1958, Carol and Fugate was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Robert Jensen and sentenced to life in prison. She spent 18 years incarcerated at the Nebraska Correctional Center for Women in York, Nebraska, before being paroled in 1976. She has lived a private life since her release, has not been involved in any further criminal activity, married in 2007, and has maintained across the decades that she was not a willing participant in what Charles Starkweather did during those 8 days in January 1958. The case inspired Bruce Springsteen's 1982 album Nebraska, Terrence Malick's 1973 film Badlands, and the Oliver Stone film Natural Born Killers, all of which drew in varying degrees from the template of the young couple on a destructive road trip that Starkweather and Fugate had made so permanently vivid in the American cultural imagination. Number 10. Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck, The Lonely Hearts Killers. The story of Raymond Martinez Fernandez and Martha Jewel Beck, known to history as the Lonely Hearts Killers, is one that begins in the loneliness and emotional vulnerability of the years immediately following the Second World War, years in which an enormous number of people across the United States were navigating the difficulties of re-establishing civilian life, finding connection after years of upheaval, and seeking companionship through whatever means were available to them in a pre-internet era when the classified pages of newspapers were one of the primary vehicles for people seeking to meet others. It is a case that illuminates how predatory behavior can identify and exploit that loneliness with devastating efficiency, and how the combination of two damaged and dangerous individuals can produce a pattern of harm that goes significantly further than either might have gone alone. Raymond Martinez Fernandez was born on December 17, 1914, in the territory of Hawaii, to Spanish immigrant parents who subsequently relocated to Bridgeport, Connecticut, where he grew up. As a teenager, Fernandez worked on his uncle's farm in Spain, where he married a young local woman, had 4 children, and subsequently abandoned them. During the latter years of the Second World War, Fernandez was working for British intelligence in Gibraltar and later made his way to the United States, and it was during this passage, in December 1945, that the event occurred which those who subsequently studied the case identified as a critical turning point in his psychological development. A steel hatch fell on Fernandez's head aboard the ship he was traveling on, causing a serious skull fracture. Those who interacted with him in the years that followed described a man whose personality had changed dramatically after the injury, becoming more impulsive, more erratic, and more focused on the manipulation and exploitation of others, and Fernandez himself acknowledged that he had been a different person before the accident. During a subsequent period of imprisonment in 1946, Fernandez was exposed to the beliefs and practices of voodoo by a fellow inmate, and he adopted elements of these beliefs as a framework for understanding and expanding what he came to describe as a supernatural ability to seduce and control women, an ability he quickly began to employ systematically against lonely women he identified through Lonely Hearts advertisements placed in newspaper columns across the United States. By the mid-1940s, Fernandez had developed a sophisticated method of operation. He would respond to Lonely Hearts advertisements placed by women seeking companionship, establish a correspondence, travel to meet them, gain their trust and affection, and then steal from them before disappearing. In several cases, the women he targeted died under circumstances that investigators later concluded were not accidental, though the full extent of the harm he caused before meeting Martha Beck was never definitively established. Martha Jewel Seabrook was born in 1920 in Milton, Florida, and by the time she encountered Raymond Fernandez's response to her own Lonely Hearts advertisement in 1947, she was 27 years old, a trained nurse working at a facility in Pensacola, Florida, the mother of 2 children born outside of marriage. a woman who had experienced significant personal rejection and unhappiness in her personal life, and who was, by her own later account, desperately lonely and starved for the kind of genuine romantic attention that Fernandez's letter offered. When the two met in person, Martha Beck fell immediately and completely under Fernandez's influence. The relationship that developed between them was intense, all-consuming, and, crucially, entirely reciprocated by Fernandez in a way that his previous targets had never been. Martha knew from early in their relationship that Raymond was engaged in his scheme of targeting lonely women, and rather than retreating from him when she understood this, she inserted herself into the scheme as his partner and companion, accompanying him on his visits to his targets and presenting herself as his sister so that the women they targeted would not be alarmed by the presence of another woman. What began as a criminal partnership in fraud and theft escalated over the following 2 years into something significantly more serious. Between 1947 and 1949, Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck were linked to the deaths of at least 17 women, though they were ultimately tried for only one killing, that of 66-year-old Janet Fay, a widow from Albany, New York, who had been corresponding with Fernandez through a Lonely Hearts Club and who was killed at a house in Valley Stream, Long Island, in January 1949, struck repeatedly with a hammer by Martha Beck in a sudden explosion of jealous rage after Fay and Fernandez became intimate. The couple had also, shortly before the Fay killing, traveled to Grand Rapids, Michigan, where another target, Delphine Downing, 41 years old, and her 2-year-old daughter Raynell were killed. Fernandez administered a sedative to Delphine that proved fatal, and Raynell was subsequently drowned in a washing tub. It was the disappearance of Delphine and Raynell Downing that prompted suspicious neighbors to contact police, who arrived at the Grand Rapids address on March 1, 1949, and discovered Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck still in residence. Fernandez confessed rapidly following his arrest. The couple was extradited to New York, where the death penalty remained in force, to face trial for the murder of Janet Fay. The New York authorities having determined that the legal circumstances of that case gave them the strongest basis for prosecution. The trial of Martha Beck and Raymond Fernandez opened on June 9, 1949, at the New York Supreme Court before Judge Ferdinand Pecora. During 44 days of testimony that generated extraordinary public interest, with crowds pressing to get into the courtroom and the press covering every detail of the proceedings with the kind of breathless attention that would later become characteristic of the era's true crime culture. The prosecution established the couple's movements, their methods, and the evidence connecting them to Janet Fay's death. The defense entered pleas of insanity for both defendants, arguing that their psychology and behavior placed them outside the realm of individuals who could be held legally responsible for their actions. The jury, composed of 10 men and 2 women, deliberated through the night of August 18 into the early hours of August 19, 1949, and returned a verdict of guilty of first-degree murder against both defendants. No mercy recommendation was offered by the jury, and Judge Pecora sentenced both Martha Beck and Raymond Fernandez to death by electrocution, a sentence to be carried out at Sing Sing Prison. Every avenue of appeal was exhausted. The New York Court of Appeals denied them a new trial. Governor Thomas Dewey denied clemency. The United States Supreme Court declined to review the case. On the morning of March 8, 1951, Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck were executed by electric chair at Sing Sing Prison on the Hudson River, Fernandez first, followed by Beck. Martha Beck's final statement to the press has been quoted in nearly every account of the case written since. She said that her story was a love story, and questioned what it mattered who was to blame. The case has been adapted for film 4 times, most notably in the 1970 cult film The Honeymoon Killers and the 2006 film Lonely Hearts, and remains a touchstone in the study of criminal partnerships, the psychology of manipulation, and the ways in which loneliness and emotional need can make individuals deeply vulnerable to those who are skilled at identifying and exploiting those needs.